the Hunger Lands. It's the kind of thing they always say, a tired and long-exhausted old cliché that you've probably heard 1,000 times. When you hear that the smashed windows of an old dilapidated house looked out at the world like eyes, or like the empty sockets of some ancient skull, it's all the listener can do not to sigh. For the Eldridge house, however, this cliché would never be used. It couldn't be, because the windows were never smashed in. Nobody would dare. Despite the years and the obvious wear on the long empty building, all of the windows were completely intact. No child in the 5 generations that the house had stood, solemn, silent and empty on the hill, would have dreamed of getting close enough to smash one of those windows. Whilst to enter the grounds and lift a stone to hurl at the glass was simply unthinkable. As such, the gravel and shale covering the earth of the building's immense grounds had barely been disturbed in decades. Some even claimed that closer to the doorway you could still see the impressions made by the feet of the last people to leave. A trail like footprints in snow, undisturbed for decades, if not centuries. Not that anyone had been close enough to check. The windows themselves had been painted over with black, and in this way, though not looking like eyes, the windows did show something of the character of the house. For rather than looking out as the ominously oracular windows of other supposedly haunted houses are meant to, they instead did the opposite. They stopped you from looking in. The windows of the Eldridge house concealed. They prevented prying, curious eyes from ever seeing what might or might not be moving inside. The opaque black coating the windows preserved and protected the building's secrets, allowing its malice and mythology to grow and fester undisturbed in the darkness. Those blackened windows told the world with their closed eyelids sleep that what remained within was not for them to see. Arnold Fremont, however, felt differently. Arnold had moved to Malton the previous summer, and all he seemed to have heard about since he arrived was that damn house. Admittedly, it did dominate the skyline, standing as it did on the hill overlooking town, like Dracula's castle or the haunted house from some crappy 1930s horror movie. He would admit that it did look the part. Its worn old boards did have that run-down, slightly gothic look that people associate with haunted houses, but that didn't in any way mean that the place was actually haunted. It couldn't be, because nowhere was. Haunted houses didn't exist. To the others, however, to his friends at school, to the older, cooler boys and the girls he had a bouquet of newly formed crushes on, the Eldridge house was a monolith. A thing that stood not only on the hill above town, but also like some horrible dead weight, as a great stone monument within their imaginations. Watching them talk about the place as an outsider was like witnessing some kind of mass hysteria, a collective terror that was passed from mothers to daughters and fathers to sons. Every other kid in town knew of someone who, decades ago, had attempted to get up to the door of the old house only to be vanquished by hands made of shadow. When he had laughed at such nonsense, the others at school had gasped, cautioning him against such talk as if it was somehow sacrilegious. As if to speak ill or make a mockery of the place was blasphemous, and he should live in fear of retribution. To him, that was already too much. When he decided for his local history project to research the house, its history, and the ridiculous levels of folklore that had grown up around it, his classmates and indeed his teacher seemed to have been positively scandalized. Did he really have the audacity to stand there and laugh in the devil's face? He wouldn't, they thought. He couldn't, but he did. When he had asked Mr. Parrish, the librarian, for any and all records relating to the Eldridge place, the old man had raised an eyebrow and inquired as to exactly what he wanted to know and why. At first, it seemed that even this sainted custodian of knowledge would turn out to be in on the mass hysteria, but when Arnold explained that his intention was to dispel the myths, Parrish's expression had softened, and within half an hour, he had presented Arnold with an enormous pile of documents, clippings, and records relating to the house, its construction, and its history. Don't suppose there's anything in here about the house being built on ancient ruins or a pet cemetery or anything like that? I mean, I'm not going to find out that folks have good reason to be scared and blow my whole argument apart, am I? Parrish gave him a wry smile. How would I know? He grinned. That, my boy, is the skill of being a historian, examining all of the evidence, checking you have all the pieces of the puzzle before deciding what picture they make. Deciding for yourself what conclusions to draw. It wouldn't be much of a profession if they just got their answers from the local librarian. Arnold returned Parrish's smile and glanced over the pile of documents. Finally, Parrish acquiesced a little, adding, "But since you ask, no, there's nothing in there about the house being built on anything other than solid rock. The house is built on firm foundations. The mythology is not." A month later, standing at the front of the classroom on a crisp autumn morning, Arnold felt brave. Looking at his classmates and their barely suppressed expressions of revulsion when he flashed up a photograph of the Eldridge place, he felt like he was bringing clarity, the light of truth that only a clinical, objective outsider's perspective could offer. Over the course of 20 minutes, Arnold worked backwards. Starting with the present day, he listed, explored, and unashamedly mocked the way in which the townsfolk of Malton crept with terrified reverence around the Eldridge place. He examined the current folklore and what people said about the site. Then he dispelled the flimsy beliefs with the concrete reality of proof. Moving back in time, Arnold went on to explain the history of the house, how long it had been empty, and who its previous occupants had been. At every available opportunity, he underscored the fact that the Eldridge place was not a thing to be feared. It was just a house. The building itself was erected early in the 18th century, and furthermore, Arnold made quite the point of highlighting, was absolutely not built upon the site of an ancient Indian burial ground, a mass grave, nor the site of ritual sacrifice and devil worship. Smiling broadly in the defiant arrogance of one who believes wholeheartedly that he knows better, he went on. The house is nothing more than bricks, wood and mortar. There are no ghosts, demons or devils living inside. What there is dust, rodents and the echoes of empty, baseless folklore, whispered over decades and tied to absolutely no facts at all. With that, Arnold concluded his presentation and waited several moments in the expectation of applause, which of course never arrived. Later in the corridor, his friends simply tried to ignore what had just happened and continued their discussions of playground politics and social maneuvering, without ever mentioning the masterwork of defiance that Arnold had just delivered. It was only a half hour later, on the way back from lunch, that two older boys called to him down the hallway. "Hey, new kid." Having been in town for 5 months and attending school for 4, he would have assumed that the nickname New Kid might have worn off by now and had been passed like a ribbon of distinction onto the next new arrival months ago. What he had not bargained upon was that as long as there was no one to take up that crown, he would always be the newest arrival. Even in a year, 2 years, or 10, if nobody else new arrived in town, he would be seen as the last one in until someone else joined the community. As this didn't seem to be an event that took place very often, in all likelihood he would end up moving into the Malton retirement home while still being referred to as New Kid. Arnold walked cautiously over to the senior boys who had summoned him, throwing only a few upward glances at the pretty older girls that accompanied them. One of the boys whom Arnold recognized from the school football team addressed him. "So I hear you're not scared of the Eldridge place, that you think you're some kind of hot shit out of towner, and that we're just a bunch of yokels who'll believe anything." Arnold, who didn't consider himself to be shit of any particular temperature, nevertheless knew that to agree with this football-playing troglodyte would probably end with him being taken to the emergency room. So he racked his brains for a nice way of saying that he just knew more than the locals, and that he was less gullible and less indoctrinated. Eventually, he settled on an answer and mumbled quietly, "I guess being from out of town, I didn't grow up being scared of the place, so..." He shrugged. his explanation losing speed with every syllable he uttered. "So, yeah, I guess I just don't see what all the fuss is about. I mean, it's just a house." The senior boys looked at each other and smiled a knowing, conspiratorial smile. "Okay," said the ringleader with a dangerous-looking grin. "Prove it." So it was that as the sun sank lazily below the horizon in Moulton, Arnold and a crowd of around 20 older students arrived at the gates of the Eldridge place. An hour earlier, Arnold had participated in his first full-blown argument with his friend Starkey, who had begged and indeed pleaded with him not to go. "You don't understand," Starkey had screamed when he heard that Arnold was planning not only to go up to the Eldridge place, but, in his words, to stroll casually up to the door, knock on it to see if anyone's home, and then stroll casually back. "You don't get it," Starkey protested. "You think because you read some stuff in history books that you have it all figured out. What about the stuff they leave out of the history books, huh? The stuff they don't want you to know, or that they don't write about because they're ashamed of it, or scared of it." He was so frustrated, so forceful, that he seemed almost to be shaking as he spoke, either from fear, anger, or both. Arnold had simply laughed. He had never been the shrewdest observer of high school politics. How the pecking order of popularity was decided and by whom was beyond him. What he did know, however, was that this kind of bold action, refusing to be cowed by the idiocy and nonsense, not to mention showing yourself to have balls of steel in front of a large audience, was the kind of thing that made your popularity shoot up. He was currently circling around the depths of the tank with Starkey and the other bottom feeders, but being the new kid, although it might have been a difficult label to shake, also granted Arnold an opportunity at reinvention. No one knew him here. It was time for him to step up, make a name for himself, and climb into the upper echelons of the school's popularity stakes. Standing at the gates, however, with the last vestiges of sunlight scurrying for the shadows, he began, for the first time, to feel that perhaps he was not quite as certain as he had been. The crowd did nothing to settle his nerves. These people, these watchers who had followed him, believed the same thing as Starkey. They genuinely thought, despite all the logic to the contrary, that if he stepped into the grounds of the Eldridge place, he would not be coming back. Yet they had all still come, hoping, or perhaps simply curious, to see his demise. He had come here in the hope of impressing them, but now, in the moments before he took the plunge, he realized it wasn't just about them. He had to prove it to himself. With a forceful step forward, Arnold Fremont opened the gate and became the first person to step onto the gravel of the Eldridge place in decades. Now, inside the walls, the space between the gate and the front door, the door he had sworn he would stride up to and knock upon, seemed to go on forever. A gravel moonscape of grey and flint reaching on for days. As he took the first few slow steps toward the door, a door that seemed to recede further into the distance, Arnold increased his pace, feeling as he did his heart beating fast, tight, and quick in his chest. The chest itself seemed to tighten, hardening and constricting with every step he took, forcing what little breath he was able to push into his lungs out in short, snatched gulps that made him think of a fish in a shrinking pool of water, sucking desperately at the air, its lips above the surface, eyes cold and staring as it struggled for breath in a place that would give it none. He considered running, sprinting to the door, slamming his palm against it for all to see, and then hurling himself quickly back. He knew it wouldn't seem as brave or self-assured. It might seem a little chicken even, but it would be better than most people had done. Still, he couldn't, not just because of how it would look, but because it didn't seem possible. At first, he thought it was his imagination. After only a few paces, he began to feel his legs tiring, as if he was not walking, but wading through shallow water, or perhaps something thicker than water, syrup or molasses, something that with every pace seemed to tug upon him, dragging him back. Each time he lifted his foot, he felt, or thought he felt, more and more of the gravel sticking, clinging to his shoes, rising and inching ever further up the shoe until the shale and tiny stones that had been underfoot seemed now to be up to his ankles. Not only that, but the stones felt somehow looser, less substantial, as if somehow there were less of them, or there was more space between. Looking down, Arnold saw that it was not an illusion. The stones were higher, crawling and squirming over his laces as if they were rising, or as if he was sinking. Arnold turned back toward the crowd, back toward those ghouls who had followed him up there. He turned to face them, realizing as he did that he no longer cared about them, no longer cared what they thought. He knew they were not right, knew that there was nothing hiding in that house, that there were no ghosts or monsters, but there were natural dangers. Dangers like quicksand. Quicksand that would absorb and swallow anything that stepped onto it, quietly sucking and pulling it downward into a silence of oblivion. Arnold finally turned all the way around and screamed toward the crowd, only to find them standing in straight-backed silence watching. They never moved a muscle. Again he screamed, trying in vain to move his feet, now submerged to the ankle, sunk and settled, sucked down like a rodent into the belly of a serpent, into the thick, clinging liquid that lay just below the surface of the gravel, concealed by its gray, white, untouched surface. Flailing with his arms, he reached down to try to pull his feet up, screeching loudly, "Help me! Jesus Christ, please help me! I'm drowning! I'm drowning, please!" As the ground gave way further, his every movement making him slip deeper and deeper down, making what was once solid ground shift and give way beneath him, as if it were absorbing him into itself, enveloping and enclosing him. He felt the cold wetness rise to his thighs, damp at first, and then as it rose up the inside leg, vice-like. Again he begged desperately for help, staring back at the line of observers which now seemed to have grown from the 20 who had been there to a throng of scores, hundreds, almost the entire population of the school. Yet not one of them spoke, not one of them moved. Instead, they simply stood, a watching wall of silent blankness. As he felt himself sinking, his waist, chest, and flailing arms disappearing into the void beneath, every movement and attempt at escape only making him sink faster, Arnold pleaded, implored them to help, but still nobody moved. Tears, acid hot and painful, streamed down his face, and for a moment the force of their coming seemed to stop at his throat, preventing him from calling out. When his voice did finally come, he bawled, awful torn and wretched cries that rang into the fading light. Glaring back toward the gate, he saw for just a moment that a single familiar figure had pushed its way to the front. Again he called, desperately, frantically to the figure, who, even in the dark, he recognized as his friend. "I tried to warn you, new kid," Starkey whispered over the silence of the others. "I tried. You were right. The house wasn't built on anything. It was built around it. The grounds are built on the Hunger Lands, the starving place. It's always been here. Just like what's inside the house has always been here long before us. The sands around the house, the Hunger Lands, that's how they feed it." As Arnold's shoulders sank beneath the silt, he felt for the first time the slithering touch as things beneath the surface squirmed and coiled around his thighs. Slender things that glided quickly, gripping and winding around him, dragging him hungrily downward. Sand, gravel, and the mealy, earthen taste of soil filled Arnold's mouth, and he was unable to scream. For a few moments, tilting back his head, he was still able, through the tiny portals of his nostrils, to breathe, until, with the awful dread inevitability of the encroaching tide, they too filled with the seeping blanket of silt. With his eyes looking down in their furthest possible extent, he caught in his final vision the tiniest fleeting glimpse of he who waits below. "Bye, new kid," said Starkey quietly, as he and the others walked in silent procession away from the house. Less than a mile away, at the Malton Public Library, Mr. Parrish replaced the book on local folklore back to its place on the shelf. Perhaps he thought the new boy would not have been quite so cocky had he read the section on the Hunger Lands. The legends of the indigenous peoples, which told of an ancient thing that used those sands like a mouth, sucking down and liquefying anything that strayed too close. A thing without a name that waited at the center, like a plump, bloated spider in its web, for something to venture in and slowly be dissolved. Perhaps if he'd known the legend of how brave warriors had laid stones and shale of the brightest white over the Hunger Lands, so that everyone could see where they were. How they had used a canoe to sail out to the middle and build an immense structure around the thing that squatted there, its tenebrous tentacle roots lined with tiny mouths, stretching out and submerged in the sand, waiting to encircle and ensnare, to drag into the silt the incautious and the damned. If he'd known how over centuries that structure had been replaced, reinforced or altered, first with a hut, then a building, later with a church built for strange rites, and later still with an immense house empty inside of all but that thing. Never really a home but a gilded cage, a wood and brick facade and a fence built to contain a danger. As Starkey had said, the place wasn't built on evil, it was built around it. Perhaps he thought if Arnold had known, he might have been saved. For a moment, Mr. Parrish almost felt guilty for checking the book out himself and concealing it from the boy. But then the moment passed. He reminded himself with a smile of satisfaction that by concealing the book from Arnold, through active demonstration and proof, he had helped an entire generation of youngsters to learn a valuable lesson.